Today I'm talking about Lovecraft and Wilbraham, Massachusetts. I'm going to give you a little sense of what Wilbraham is before we start out here, and then I'll get into how this is all relevant to Lovecraft. Wilbraham, Massachusetts is a town in south-central Massachusetts. It's east of Springfield. It's relatively small, about 15,000 today, about a fifth that size in Lovecraft's day. It's old, 1730 is when it was originally founded. Now, the reason for my interest in this has nothing to do with any of the academic interests listed there. Mine is a personal story that has to do with the fact that my parents just moved out there recently. My father needed to take care of his aging parents in their 90s, and so they bought a house out there. None of us really knew that much about the area, although my father did grow up nearby there. And so I pulled it up on Wikipedia, and lo and behold, I saw that one of the entries said Lovecraft stayed there for a week in 1928. And I thought, well, that's fantastic. I like Lovecraft. So why don't I figure out where he stayed and if that building is still there. And so I tried to figure it out online, couldn't find anything there. Emailed S.T. Joshi. Joshi said, I totally know, but I can't remember right now. Why don't you email Kenneth Fagg? I emailed Kenneth Fagg. He said, yep, I know. Here's the exact address you need to know. You go to 782 Munson Road, and there's a house there, and that's where she stayed. And he also gave me the name of a book. He gave me a book, Dead Houses and Other Works, and that was a book of the works of Edith Minot, who he was staying with, whom Lovecraft was staying with in 1928. And so that sparked my interest going there, taking a look at this property, saying, ah, look, there's a place Lovecraft stayed. Here's a little bit from a letter, I'm sorry, not a letter, a memorial essay that Lovecraft wrote about Edith Minot, and that's where I'm drawing almost everything I'm going to put up here today from that document. He called it Edith Minot Estimates and Recollections, and it was, eulogizing her life. A lot of it was about her own contributions, but a portion of it was about his slightly over a week, 8 days that he spent there. An 8-day visit to the household at Maplehurst in July 1928 formed my last personal glimpse of Mrs. Minot. I had never seen the Wilbraham region before and was charmed by the vivid vistas of hills and valleys and the remote winding roads so redolent of other centuries. This is the property where he stayed there. You can still go see it today on Munson Road. It's just two 90-degree turns from where my parents bought their house out there, so it's great to find it so easily. 782. This property was not the property of Mrs. Minot. She was staying there with an elderly woman who was a distant cousin, Miss Phoebe. And Miss Phoebe was a local historian. No better hierophants of the local arcana than Mrs. Minot and Miss Phoebe could possibly have been found, and my knowledge of Central New England lore was virtually trebled during my short stay. This shows up a little bit in Lovecraft's works. We see that Mrs. Minot, who was the kind of keeper of lore, contributed the idea that a window pane, when it's been stared through for many, many, many years and decades, takes on the image of the person who looked through that window. If you recall, that shows up in a Lovecraft story. I can't for the life of me name it, but you'll all probably remember the one. That contribution of the folklore was definitely significant, but the much more significant story is one that shows up in the Dunwich Horror. And everything I'm going to continue to talk about today is very Dunwich Horror adjacent, because this is the part of the world, this is the region that Lovecraft drew from when he was describing Dunwich and its environs. Even though he physically places that elsewhere in the state of Massachusetts, this is what he was talking about. And one of the stories, here's a little Phoebe Road that still exists there today. One of the stories that he got during his time there was one of whippoorwills. He says, I saw the ruinous, deserted old Randolph Movie House where the whippoorwills cluster abnormally, and learned that these birds are feared by the rustics as evil psychopomps. It is whispered that they linger and flutter around houses where death is approaching, hoping to catch the soul of the departed as it leaves. That should be leaves. If the soul eludes them, they disperse in quiet disappointment, but sometimes they set up a chorus clamor of excitement, triumphant, chattering, which makes the watchers turn pale and mutter with that air of hushed, awestruck portentousness which only backwoods Yankees can assume. They got him. If you've read Dunwich Horror, if you haven't read Dunwich Horror, you're probably in for the air conditioning, so just enjoy the rest of this. But if you've read Dunwich Horror, you know that this not only appears in the story, but makes up kind of an ebb and flow that returns several times in the story as you watch these characters come to their deaths and figure out whether their souls escape. He also wrote, one day Mrs. Minot showed me a deep, mute ravine beyond the Randolph Movie House, along whose far-off wooded floor an unseen stream trickles in eternal shadow. Here, I am told, the whippoorwills gather on certain nights for no good purpose. These whippoorwills come from this part of the world. They come from Mrs. Miniatur's story, and they make it deeply into that story. Well, as I began to continue reading this document, I realized that there's a number of other specific locations in the Wilbraham area that Lovecraft talks about seeing. So then I set out to trying to find these locations as they exist today and get a look at them. So that's what the remainder of this talk is going to be about. This, by the way, this is kind of my apology for the fact that this Randolph Movie House, which is almost certainly in Lovecraft's mind when he's picturing the decrepit Whately estate, is no longer there, as far as I can tell. I've looked at satellite photos, I haven't gone up and knocked on the door, but it seems to be gone. But I did bring you photos, at least, of, even though it's too dark to even see what you're looking at, I'll switch to this one's a little easier, the giant dark wood barn that is still there at the Beebe house. I can't prove that this was around at the time, but it's certainly old enough that it could have been contemporary. Lovecraft briefly describes the barn being there at the time, saying that it was a huge spectral place with an immense hayloft, which this certainly has an immense hayloft, and those of you familiar with the Dunwich Horror know that this is very likely the barn he had in his mind when he was picturing the other brother getting larger and larger in the barn. So I apologize for not having anything better, more direct to share from the story than that. The rest of these are much less related to Dunwich Horror, just to Lovecraft's own experience of the place. He describes a time when Mrs. Miniatur displayed the moss-grown graveyards of the place, one of which, the dell, includes a dank, wooded declivity besides a stream that is said to wash away the earth and expose curious secrets at times. So the dell is still there. It's a woodland dell. It's very near to the turnoff of Munson Road, and it's tucked back a little bit from the main street, which is called Main Street. And you can find this declivity still. I apologize again, the lighting here is fairly bright, so you can't see much of the detail. But what you're seeing here beyond these gravestones is that there is a drop-off into a ravine here. There's a closer view of the ravine. It's not massive, but it's a drop-off of about 40 feet or so into this ravine. And you can see here where there are gravestones where it's carved away at the graveyard. I didn't see any secrets exposed there when I was there, but it doesn't mean they weren't there and I didn't know how to see them. By the way, I did also briefly look through the documents I could find for bishops and Whateleys buried there to see if he borrowed those names from local gravestones. I couldn't find any indication that they were there. He speaks of the old brick academy built in 1852 and still surviving after many vicissitudes. That's another interesting site. This is the Wilbraham Academy. It would have been at his time. It's called the Wilbraham and Munson Academy today. It's a preparatory school. He, as I said, puts it at 1852. It's considerably older as an institution. It started in 1804, but in New Hampshire. It was one of the oldest preparatory schools in the East Coast at the time. And it moved here in 18, I wrote it somewhere and I don't recall it, 25 to Wilbraham. So it had already been there for a long time before the building he must have been looking at was established. A number of the buildings from Lovecraft's time still stand there, and you can see them today with some great architectural features like this. He also talks about, and this is in here sort of as a joke, because I was constantly thinking about this when I was traveling around looking for sites. He talks about among the varied and exquisite prospects along this route is one of the strangely blasted slope where gray dead trees claw at the sky, leafless boughs amid an abomination of desolation. Vegetation will grow here no longer. Why? No one can tell. So I thought, I'm gonna look for it. I'll see if there's still a blasted space. You know, if you're familiar with Dunwich Horror, that this idea of a place where things don't grow is present in there, and it's present in some of Lovecraft's other works as well. And I took this photo at the cemetery just as a joke to bring you of this blasted piece of grass where nothing would grow. But then I'll be darned if I wasn't driving. Oh, first of all, I should preface this by saying the place he was talking about, we have a good sense of what road he's talking about when he says along this route. That place is very developed now. So wherever this space was, it's probably got a $2 million home built there at that point. But lo and behold, while I was driving around doing this, I found this patch of trees where none are growing in among a bunch of others, which I'm sure was something like what he was seeing at the time, either a place where floodwaters caused a bunch of trees to die, or a blight hit a particular grove that had been planted, or something like that. So there are still blasted spaces for you to see if you'd like to in the Wilbraham area. He also discusses the fact that Mrs. Miniatur gave him directions for a walk too long for her to attempt, and he followed it to an ancient road full of striking vistas to the pleasant village of Hamden. That photo I just showed you is on the road to Hamden, on one of the roads you can take from Wilbraham to Hamden. Here stands a World War memorial, obviously World War I, in the most flamboyant taste, or lack of taste, of Civil War times. The gift of an aged local magnate who remembered the past and knew what he wanted. So I'm picturing, this is Lovecraft's idea of unnecessarily flamboyant memorial. It's just a guy on a pedestal memorial that was too much for him to bear. But you can tell, of course, that this is very Civil War-like in its nature. If you saw that driving by, I know a certain eye at least would have thought it was a Civil War memorial, until I looked more closely at how he was attired. So there is his overly flamboyant memorial in Hamden. Now the other thing that was in Hamden, and really the last site that I'm going to talk about, was a church. And it was only briefly mentioned here. The traditional white steeple church building shelters a thriving grocery store, one of those humor-fraught contrasts which Mrs. Minot always delighted. And I liked this particularly because, first of all, churches are fairly easy to find, and churches have pretty good records, so you can figure out where they were even if they're not there anymore. But also because this is in the Dunwich Horror. It's just one line, it's not even one line, it's part of one line. It is not reassuring to see on a closer glance that most of the houses are deserted and falling to ruin, and that the broken steepled church now harbors the one slovenly mercantile establishment of the hamlet. So he wrote this steeple on this church, put it into the story, and I thought, well, this is great, I should be able to find this. So I went through Hamden, I found two possibilities. One was a relatively large church with a tall steeple, but it didn't seem likely because it was very new when he'd been there. It was established in 1926. He was in there again in 1928. And it's still an active church today. So if it had been a mercantile for a period, I thought, well, that might be, but it doesn't seem likely. I found the Historical Society, the Hamden Historical Society, which also appears to be in a former church building, not much of a steeple on it. I wrote to them and said, hey, I'm looking for a church that used to be a grocery store. Do you know where there is one? And they said, oh, we'll get right on that and see if we can figure it out. I never heard back, but I'm assuming it's not the building that they're in, or they would probably have known that about it. So I thought, well, it may be just gone and lost. Fortunately, though, I was able, through some sources, to find a book that makes reference to it. I only have a terrible blurry picture that is taken with a cell phone of a book and emailed to me. It was a Baptist church very early on, and it did indeed burn down 4 years after he was there, but it had been a grocery store as well. Here's another view of the church. And that was exciting enough, and I thought, there I will end my story, but we're only 12 minutes and 30 seconds in, so I must have something more to say, and that is that there's a personal coda to this, because as I was reading the description of that church, it said, the Baptist church was indeed a busy area. Not only did it accommodate a large country store in the vestry, but behind its horse shed was a shelter for the town hearse at one period. Proprietors of the retail establishment over the years were Horton Hendrick, Mr. Scripter, W.P. Fuller, Sumner Smith, Julius Gotchi, Willie Pease, Harry Temple. One of those is related to me, and I won't tell you which one for reasons that become apparent here in a moment. And I thought, oh my gosh, like I'm physically, literally related to a thing that was then put into a Lovecraft story. That's a great feeling. I'm a Lovecraft character, isn't it? And so I started to look up the branch of the family that's descended from this particular side. And the current generation, I shouldn't say current, my generation, I'm not the current generation anymore, but my age generation, that guy's in jail for 25 years for murdering his housemate over a sandwich. So I decided, I'm not going to pursue that part of the family after all. Lovecraft, of course, saw that this place was changing, was aware of it changing at the time, and lamented this, as you can imagine. He talked about it, and that's where I would say the name for my talk today. He says, the city word tide set in. The city is Springfield here. The city word tide set in, and some of the most vigorous stock vanished, to return only for burial in the spectral cemeteries near the village. Funerals, Mrs. Minot once wrote, came to be Wilbraham's chief industry. Deserted houses grew common, and some of the humbler farmers began to show queer softenings of morale and queer vagaries in their standards. Then he says some racist stuff about Polish people, and then he goes on to say, a new element of somberness was added to the background of persistent legend, the somberness of decay, desolation, and impending change. Thank you very much.